What if one war didn't just defeat a country, but erase its future? In the heart of South America, rivers became chains, children became soldiers, and an entire nation was pushed to the edge of disappearance. This is the war Latin America still hasn't finished mourning. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lora, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. In Corrientes, in June of 1866, the war was not a banner snapping clean in the wind, and it was not a president promising glory from a balcony. The war was a smell that refused to leave 5 improvised hospitals, where 500 wounded men lay stacked inside heat and rot as if the province itself had become a lung that could no longer breathe. One correspondent counted the doctors, no more than 2, and then he counted what iron had done to the body. Arms torn away, legs gone, men reduced to whatever remains when metal decides where flesh ends. He warned that typhus was breeding in filth like a second enemy army, silent, invisible, undefeated, and then he asked a question that makes metals turn to rust in your hand. What right do we have to send a soldier into battle if he can later die of hunger, abandoned on a hospital floor? Hold on to that question, because before this story ends, the rivers will be chained, the children will be drafted, and the continent will answer Paraguay's near death with a vow that sounds like prayer. They called it the War of the Triple Alliance, the Paraguayan War, the Guerra Grande, the Guerra Guasú, and even the names feel heavy in the mouth because they were built to carry grief. It lasted more than 5 years, from the first clashes in 1864 until the last pursuit ended with Francisco Solano Lopez dead in 1870, and those are the clean facts that sit neatly on paper in a way corpses never do. When you ask how many died, you enter a room where historians still argue over censuses, propaganda, missing villages, and the difference between a battlefield death and a slow disappearance by hunger or disease. The total losses rise into the hundreds of thousands, with Paraguay and Brazil carrying much of the blood. But what no serious telling disputes is the shape of the disaster. Names like Tuyutí, Mud, Curupaytí, river guns, and Humaitá, throat choke fortress remained carved into streets and schools, while Paraguay's social fabric was torn so profoundly that the survivors lived in the absence. If you want to understand why this happened, you do not start in palaces, because palaces always speak in clean sentences. You begin on water, because in the Rio de la Plata basin, rivers are not scenery. They are roads, borders, veins, and traps, and whoever controls them controls the breath of a landlocked nation. One witness, traveling by steamer, described Paraguay as exuberant vegetation and glittering lagoons, beautiful and dangerous at the same time, as if the earth itself were warning you not to trust it. In this war, geography was a weapon that didn't need to be fired. Swamps that swallowed boots, forests that swallowed armies, and 2 significant corridors, the Paraná and the Paraguay, that could carry reinforcements and rumors, but could also carry epidemics and corpses. When people later argued about heroes, they often forgot that the land killed as faithfully as the cannon did, and it killed without ever needing a speech. The fuse was Uruguay, that narrow strip of country between larger hungers, where the powerful learned to tug and push without declaring their hands. Uruguay was created in 1828 as a buffer between Argentina and Brazil. That buffer never stopped burning internally, because Blancos and Colorados kept smoldering in cycles of civil conflict that spilled into every neighboring calculation. By the end of the 1850s, Brazil's economic and social presence had thickened on Uruguayan soil. Tens of thousands of Brazilians, many from Rio Grande do Sul, settled there with enslaved labor, forming a substantial portion of the population and owning a significant share of land, moving cattle across the frontier as if borders were suggestions written for other people. When Uruguay's Blanco government tried to restrict settlement and slaveholding and to control and tax cross-frontier trade, it didn't sound like a grand ideological clash in a newspaper. It sounded like a rancher's profit threatened, like a gaucho's work shifting, like an enslaved person's chains traveling with the herd. Paraguay watched all of this with the gaze of a country that could not afford to pretend it lived alone. Landlocked, dependent on river navigation, surrounded by larger neighbors with territorial claims and long memories, Paraguay had learned to fear and distrust the region's shifting alliances And fear is never passive. It builds walls, it sharpens knives, it demands strength. In the decades before the war, Paraguay's state pursued modernization with urgency. Industry and infrastructure, arsenals and shipyards, ironworks and communications, drawing on foreign technicians, often British, and on technologies to build capacity from within. The state controlled large portions of land and exercised monopolies over key exports like yerba mate. And whether you interpret that as sovereignty tightly guarded or power tightly concentrated, it mattered because it created something rare in the basin, a small country that looked capable of refusing its neighbors' orders. And in a region where the strong were used to the weak staying quiet, a quiet country becoming capable is itself perceived as provocation, even when it is also self-preservation. In April of 1863, the spark jumped. Venancio Flores, a Colorado caudillo, launched a rebellion against the Blanco government of Bernardo Barro, and he did not do it alone. Argentina and Brazil supported him, and that alliance, two larger powers leaning into Uruguayan internal fire, changed the balance of the entire river system. Bartolomé Mitre in Argentina had reasons rooted in his own fragile national consolidation, and Brazil's reasons were tangled in settlers, land, and the expectation that the empire would protect Brazilian subjects and profits across the border. For Paraguay, the pattern looked like a tightening noose. Brazil asserting itself openly in Uruguay, Argentina aligned with Brazil, the buffer state collapsing into a corridor of influence that could choke Paraguay's security and river access. Francisco Solano Lopez, newly in power after his father's death, issued warnings against what he saw as a threat to the region's balance, and he mobilized too, because he believed Paraguay's new strength had to be felt if it was to be respected. Fear and ambition braided together until even the men holding the braid could no longer tell where one ended. In August of 1864, Brazil issued an ultimatum to Uruguay, threatening retaliation over alleged abuses against Brazilian subjects, and Paraguay answered with its own ultimatum warning Brazil against intervention. Brazil ignored it, and on October 16, Brazilian troops invaded Uruguay. The paper language ultimatums, diplomacy, casus belli, sounds clean until you translate it into what the poor experienced. Troops crossing, farms disrupted, ports blockaded, the small country crushed between larger appetites. On November 12th, Lopez seized the Brazilian steamer Marquês de Olinda as it left Asunción for Corumbá with the president of Mato Grosso aboard, and the basin's tension snapped into open war. Paraguay declared war on Brazil and invaded Mato Grosso. The story that would later be told in capitals began, as wars often do, with men marching through hostile land believing history would remember them, unaware that history would mostly remember the dead they stepped over. Then came the hinge that turned a border fire into a continental furnace. Paraguay sought passage across Argentine territory to strike toward Rio Grande do Sul and to support Uruguay's Blancos. In March of 1865, Paraguay declared war on Argentina and soon invaded Corrientes, and the gamble was enormous because it meant Paraguay had chosen to fight not just an empire, but the region's shifting coalition at once. The debate over Lopez, defender of sovereignty, reckless gambler, caudillo intoxicated by power, has filled entire libraries, and the truth is that motive does not resurrect the dead. What matters for trench history is consequence. Once Corrientes was invaded, once Argentina and Brazil could frame Paraguay as aggressor, the coalition Paraguay feared became the coalition Paraguay faced. The river system that had been a lifeline hardened into a battlefield, and the people living along its banks learned what it means when states decide that border provinces are an acceptable sacrifice. Corrientes felt the war as civilians always do, not through treaties, but through boots, on cobblestone and smoke rising where a roof used to be. Accounts describe Paraguayan troops moving with little restraint, hostages taken, homes burned, families scattered, women and children fleeing into uncertainty, while the elderly carried what they could lift. One testimony insists indigenous people were killed, and whether every detail can be counted like coins, the pattern is recognizable across the continent's wars. Those already treated as disposable by frontier violence become even more disposable when states bleed and panic. Corrientes endured occupation and the exhausting rhythm of a city taken, retaken, evacuated, retaken. And the human meaning of that rhythm is simple. War turns family names into lists of hostages, and it turns home into a rumor you run away from because staying might mean becoming part of the inventory. Far from Corrientes, crowds could still applaud, because applause is easiest when you are not the one who must sleep with gunfire outside your door. Meter, addressing people hungry for certainty, boasted that in 24 hours, soldiers would be back in their barracks, in 15 days the campaign would be over, and in 3 months they would be in Asuncion. That kind of promise is not just arrogance, it is how states sell death to people who don't yet smell it. Yet the underside appears even in the same historical record. The war was unpopular in Argentina in essential sectors, recruitment faced resistance, and men were coerced into uniforms because low-income families knew what elites often pretend not to know. Wars are paid for twice, once in blood and again in the ruin that follows. When a wage earner never comes home. The early war's psychology mattered because a war sold as quick becomes harder to stop once it becomes long. And long wars require states to squeeze harder. On May 1st, 1865, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay signed the Treaty of the Triple Alliance, binding themselves to defeat Paraguay, overthrow Lopez, and secure navigation in the river system. It also contained secret territorial understandings that mattered because secret clauses are not abstract when you are the one being invaded. On paper, it was diplomacy. In the trenches, it meant the enemy had already written down what he intended to take once you were too weak to refuse. And in 1866, the treaty's secret dimensions became publicly visible in Britain when it was tabled in Parliament, stirring international controversy, not because empires suddenly grew moral hearts, but because publicity changes the story nations tell about themselves. For Paraguay, the knowledge that territory and sovereignty were explicitly on the table transformed the war from a campaign into a struggle for existence, and existential wars make compromise feel like surrender, even when surrender might save lives. The first phase of fighting moved like a fever through the borderlands. Paraguayan columns pushed outward, the Allies struggled with distance and coordination, and even moments of apparent unity were laced with rivalry and pride. In Uruguayana, tension erupted within the alliance itself. Brazilians resisted Mitre authority in what they considered Brazilian territory. Threats flew between commanders, and the Emperor Dom Pedro II arrived to assert his authority with a bluntness that revealed how fragile Allied unity could be beneath the signatures. That fracture matters to your story because alliances in Latin America have often been marriages of convenience rather than shared identity, and the men who die in those alliances are rarely the ones who chose them. The soldier in the mud does not fight for clause language. He fights because someone tied his hands, handed him a rifle, and told him the nation demanded it. Then the river made its judgment. On June 11th, 1865, at Riachuelo on the Paraná, the Brazilian Navy destroyed Paraguay's naval capacity in a decisive engagement, enabling a blockade that would tighten around Paraguay for the rest of the war. Once the embargo settled in, hunger entered the conflict as a strategy rather than an accident. When a country's access to trade and supplies is throttled, disease spreads faster, provisioning collapses, and even victory becomes a form of slow starvation endured. Riachuelo is, según muchas estimaciones, described as the only major fleet-to-fleet naval battle of the war. And even if later naval actions continued, bombardments, river passages, ironclads pushing through fire, the strategic meaning remains. Paraguay would fight with its throat squeezed by ships and batteries. The basin's waterways became a weapon aimed not just at armies, but at the civilian capacity to survive. By April of 1866, the Allies crossed at Paso de la Patria. It invaded Paraguay with a force whose numbers sound impressive on paper and still feel fragile when you imagine the terrain swallowing them. Soldiers quickly learned what politicians rarely admit. Land is not neutral. Dense forests and esteros made ambush easy, and fortifications used rivers and swamps like walls. Men's shoes dissolved in mud, feet shredded by obstacles placed not to kill instantly but to slow movement until artillery could do its work. Meanwhile, Paraguayan soldiers, many marching barefoot, moved with the intimacy of people defending ground they knew by smell and memory. In Latin America, where so many wars are fought along rivers and plains that feed families, geography becomes personal. It is not just where battles happen, it is what people lose when a battlefield becomes a graveyard. On May 24th, 1866, Tuyutí erupted into what, según muchas estimaciones, is remembered as the most significant and bloodiest battle ever fought on South American soil. Whether one source counts the dead slightly differently from another, the scale of the slaughter is not in doubt. Tens of thousands collided in a landscape of mud and water, and when men fell, they did not fall onto clean earth. They fell into the same wet ground they had been drinking from, and the water that sustained them became contaminated by their bodies. Accounts describe Paraguayan losses as devastating, Allied losses as heavy, and the strategic consequence as cruel. Paraguay spent a portion of its fighting capacity that could not easily be replaced, while the Allies discovered that even massive bloodshed did not automatically crack Paraguay's defensive system. Victory in this war often meant only that you were still alive enough to face the next month, and that is the kind of victory that turns veterans quiet for the rest of their lives. After Tuyutí came a silence that did not feel like peace. It felt like the lungs preparing for another scream. A correspondent wrote that the calm kills spirits, and the phrase is accurate because waiting strips men down more slowly than bullets do. Horses thinned, engineers dug under fire to raise batteries, and men played cards. They traded photographs and wrote letters that tried to sound normal, because normality is a spell soldiers cast to keep from imagining the next mass grave. At night, ships moved cannon and supplies like shadows, rumors rose like mosquitoes, and every quiet moment carried the suspicion that it was only quiet because the enemy was gathering breath. This is where your Latin Lora rhythm shines. You do not rush, because long wars are made of long stretches where nothing happens except fear eating men from the inside. When the killing returned, it returned close enough to see the whites of another man's eyes. In July of 1866 at Yataiti Cora in the Boquerón, accounts describe Paraguayan infantry rushing with bayonet charges, Allied lines holding through stubbornness and panic, bodies left piled in heaps where the living later had to step carefully so they didn't slip in blood. Bayonet fighting is the most intimate kind of state violence. You feel the resistance of another human being as you push steel into him, and whatever ideology brought you there dissolves into an animal decision to live another minute. Even sleep was shelled. Some descriptions remember Curupaytí's cannon as ceaseless, turning the night into a vibrating anxiety where men learned to doze between explosions the way exhausted laborers doze between shifts. And then the war reappeared in its most obscene form, not the dramatic charge, but the slow abandonment after. Corrientes again, 5 hospitals again, 500 wounded again, 2 doctors again, typhus rising like a shadow that refused to leave. The correspondent's question, what right do we have, was not philosophy. It was logistics, corruption, and neglect made moral. He wrote of soldiers owed months of pay, of contractors treating the wounded like animals, of supplies becoming business opportunities. At the same time, men bled out on floors, and he spoke of Colonel Garcia dead in extreme poverty, leaving behind a disabled sister and a daughter, as if even death had a price tag that families would keep paying. This is the trench truth most national monuments cannot hold. War doesn't only kill men, it finds the living with lifelong ruin. In early September of 1866, the Allies took Curuzu, and proclamations celebrated valor and captured cannon, but in the camp the dead did not glow with glory. They lay heavy, and they began to smell before the ink dried. That contrast between official language and bodily reality is one of the most potent engines in your script, because it consistently exposes how elites launder suffering into rhetoric. A victory that costs hundreds or thousands of lives is not experienced as a victory by the mother who receives no body, only news, and it is not experienced as a victory by the wounded man who survives only to be placed in a hospital where typhus waits. Even when armies move forward on a map, the human experience often moves only from one form of misery into another. 9 days after Curuzu, Mitre met Lopez at Yataiti Cora, and in that meeting you can feel the ghost of a different ending hovering over the basin. Some interpretations treat it as Lopez seeking a way out as Paraguayan losses mounted and replenishment became impossible. Others stress Allied suspicion that any negotiation was a maneuver to split the coalition and evade the treaty's aims. Dom Pedro II refused to treat with Lopez, framing the conflict as civilization against despotism. Whether one sees that as a moral stance or a political posture, its consequence is unmistakable. The chance for an earlier peace collapsed, and once that door closed, the war's logic hardened. Existential wars do not end neatly. They end with bodies stacked in hospitals, with children in uniform, with a country pursued until it can no longer run. Curupaytí came on September 22nd, 1866, and it remains a wound in South American memory because it was a massacre wrapped in strategic miscalculation. Naval bombardment thundered, smoke thickened over the river, defensive obstacles and mines, called torpedoes in the language of the time, turned water into hidden death, and then infantry advanced into prepared positions. Accounts remember not only the tactical failure but the personal tragedies, the named dead whose futures were still attached to them. A mortally wounded man trying to answer a doctor through a hole in his chest, another raising a revolver at rescuers because, even dying, he feared indignity. Whether every anecdote is preserved exactly as it happened, the emotional truth remains the same. Curupaytí shattered confidence. An army without confidence walks more slowly toward the next hill because it senses the mountain is already a grave. After Curupaytí, advance stalled, and the war began to feel less like a campaign and more like a climate, something you live inside, something that stains everything, something you cannot imagine ending. Rumors of peace rose and died. Spies slipped through lines disguised as sellers of yerba mate. Fear of unseen river mines haunted men at night because invisible death is always more terrifying than visible death. The ordinary soldier, unpaid and sick, stared at the horizon and realized the truth that war teaches in every century. The state can demand your body and then forget you once it has spent what it wanted. This is why your Corrientes opening is so effective. It makes the entire war feel like one lengthy moral indictment, not of one nation alone, but of the regional habit of spending people with low incomes as currency. Above Curupaytí stood Humaitá, the fortress that turned the river into a locked door, and even its name sounds like a hinge groaning under pressure. Descriptions emphasize why it mattered. Artillery facing the river, defensive works anchored in water and swamp, obstacles that forced ships into kill zones, and a geography that made frontal assault feel like suicide. Humaitá is where your river motif becomes destiny. A landlocked nation's lifeline becomes a choke point, and the struggle over navigation becomes a struggle over national breathing. Voices from the margins appear here in the way they often do in Latin American war. Escaped peons, people whose names rarely enter official history, reporting hunger among sentinels and the presence of muchachos, boys in the defensive ranks. Whether every count is exact, the image is chillingly consistent with the war's trajectory. The longer the war lasted, the younger and hungrier Paraguay's defenders became. This is where you must handle demographic claims with both honesty and force. Paraguay mobilized intensely, its armed capacity drawn deeply from its adult male population, and that intensity became a trap once losses mounted, because Paraguay did not have endless provinces untouched by war or waves of immigrants to refill emptied villages. Yet when you state exact pre-war and post-war totals, you should acknowledge in voice that scholarship disputes the precise percentage of loss, with interpretations ranging from catastrophic to near annihilating depending on census readings and methods. The cleanest LatinLora line is also the truest. Whatever number you accept, each dead Paraguayan was not only a soldier lost, he was a farmer, a craftsman, a father, a future elder, and the country bled roles as much as it bled bodies. That is what collapse means in human terms. Across the lines, Paraguay narrowed into hunger, and hunger is the kind of enemy that doesn't need to be brave. Reports describe provisioning collapsing into obscene ratios, women unable to sow or harvest, communication controlled, orders issued in Guarani, the regime watching its own people as tightly as it watched the enemy. Because when a country is starving, the first rebellion is simply walking away. In that tightening spiral, the war began to eat the young. Accounts speak of boys taken from school, boys captured by the Allies, 12 and 14 years old, and later drafts pulling in children and elders. No ideology makes a child a legitimate chess piece. There is only desperation, and desperation is what annihilation looks like in slow motion. When the state begins scraping the bottom of childhood for bayonets, the war has already entered a darker chapter of history. Brazil, by contrast, became the engine that kept the alliance moving, and the way it built that engine matters if you want a Latin American perspective that refuses sanitized imperial triumph. Brazil expanded its army through recruitment that included pressure, transfers, and coercion, and it mobilized men whose freedom was entangled with service. Scholarship on Brazilian mobilization shows how enslaved men entered the war effort through manumission arrangements and state pressure, turning the battlefield into a stage where citizenship, slavery, and obligation collided. The language of volunteers could hide compulsion, and the empire's ability to sustain forces over time was tied not only to the workforce, but to resources, industry, and access to external finance. One side could keep buying weapons when the first batch ran out, the other could only melt down what it already had. The alliance's burdens were not carried evenly. That unevenness is itself part of the tragedy because it reveals how coalitions work in the Americas. Unity at the top, unequal sacrifice at the bottom. As Paraguay's threat to Argentine territory faded, Argentina's on-the-ground commitment shrank, while internal conflict and disease continued to gnaw at its fragile consolidation. Uruguay, which had helped ignite the fuse through its internal struggle and foreign intervention, remained the smallest actor in the main theater and continued bleeding politically, its leaders assassinated, as if the country could not escape the violence that had set the war in motion. Brazil shouldered the most significant sustained military weight, and Paraguay carried the greatest existential cost, and between them lay the corpses of men who never had a vote in the treaties that claimed them. From 1867 to 1868, the war became a slow strangulation, punctuated by moments of annihilation. Encirclement, river crossings under fire, commanders replaced, fortresses evacuated, and retreats that turned towns into waypoints of exhaustion. Humaitá was ultimately bypassed and emptied, ironclads appeared near Asuncion, and by early 1869 the Paraguayan capital was occupied, a moment that many would have expected to end the war if this were a clean 19th century conflict with polite rules. But this war had long since stopped being polite. Lopez fled, formed a new resistance, and the fighting continued as a pursuit through a country already hollowed out. When wars become a pursuit, the boundary between battle and hunting blurs, and the hunted are often civilians and children as much as soldiers. The last stretch reads like chasing a ghost through ashes. Peri bebui, smoke, Campo Grande, dry grass, also called Acosta Nu, child voices, followed, and the name Acosta Nu carries a particular horror in Paraguayan memory because it evokes a battlefield where the line between soldier and child was fatally thin. You do not need to embellish that, you only need to narrate it with restraint, because the fact that children were present in the machinery of war is already unbearable. Lopez continued northward, the Allies followed, and the end came at Cerro Corá in 1870, on el Primero de Marzo, with Lopez killed in the far northeast, near the Aquidauban. Even when sources disagree on details, the image remains. A state reduced to fugitives, meeting the full weight of coalition power, and a war ending not with a negotiated settlement between equals, but with the death of the hunted and the silence that follows when a country realizes it has survived only by being permanently changed. Afterward, Paraguay was left like a house after a fire, standing in places, but emptied of what made it home. Territory was ceded in post-war settlements, indemnities were imposed, fortifications dismantled, occupation lingered, and even when some financial demands were later reduced or canceled, the shadow lasted for decades, with Brazilian claims described in academic synthesis as extending deep into the 20th century. The demographic catastrophe is the most hotly debated part of the ruin. Here you must be both honest and relentless. Historians debate exact percentages and totals, but multiple scholarly discussions agree that Paraguay suffered an exceptional demographic and social blow, including severe distortions in family structure and gender ratios, and the loss of productive capacity that no quick recovery narrative can erase. Here we step into the ground where the evidence debates numbers, but it does not debate the hollow space. People were missing, hands were missing, whole generations were missing. Treaties tried to stitch borders back onto the wound. Brazil and Paraguay made peace in the early 1870s. Argentina and Paraguay later. Arbitration settled parts of the Chaco dispute, and foreign flags lingered on Paraguayan soil long after the last major battles ended. Peace arrived late, like a letter delivered after the funeral. And late peace has its own cruelty because survivors are expected to rebuild while still hearing the war in their bones. Brazil paid heavily too. Dead from combat and disease, financial strain, political consequences. Yet Brazil could afford payment in ways Paraguay could not, and the war accelerated transformations inside Brazil's state and society, including debates sharpened by the contradiction of enslaved men fighting in the name of the empire. Argentina emerged with strengthened central authority and consolidated national direction, while Uruguay remained small and vulnerable, its politics stained by the violence that had helped ignite the wider fire. And then the continent spoke in a different register, not with cannon, but with memory and judgment. Several South American states opposed the war and offered mediation, reading the conflict as an aberration that threatened the region's moral and political balance. Whether or not mediation could have stopped the machinery once it was moving, the fact of regional reverberation matters. Latin America watched Latin America bleed. Bolivia reappeared in post-war territorial knots, and the river basin's violence echoed into later disputes, because wars do not end where treaties say they end. They end where consequences stop spreading, and consequences rarely stop politely. This is the broader Latin American frame your channel thrives in. The war was not just four flags, it was a continental lesson in what happens when sovereignty, trade routes, and pride collide over human bodies. Colombia, which did not fight in the war, answered afterward with one of the most haunting gestures of solidarity recorded in regional memory. In 1870, in the wake of Paraguay's near annihilation, Colombia passed a law granting nationality to Paraguayans, a declaration rooted not in profit but in empathy, as if one nation saw another's extinction approaching and chose to speak out against it. The remembered words cut through the century like a blade of conscience. Just by stepping onto Colombian soil, and if they want it, they will have a homeland. Whether you treat the latter saying "Todo Paraguayo es colombiano" as a slogan or as a living bond, the moral meaning is clear. When Paraguay's dead could not be brought back, at least the survivors were seen. That recognition is also part of the war's history, and including it keeps your narrative from becoming only despair. It becomes ancestral testimony. So we end where we began, because a requiem is a circle that returns to the unanswered question. Corrientes again. 5 hospitals, 500 wounded, 2 doctors, typhus rising, and a correspondent asking what right any nation has to call this glory when it cannot even keep a man alive after he is already paid with his flesh. The War of the Triple Alliance was not a victory parade, not in any telling that respects the dead. It was a river choked with iron, a fortress guarding a chained throat, an alliance held together by paper. In contrast, people experiencing poverty had it together with bones, and a defeated country whose social fabric was torn so thoroughly that even survivors lived in the absence. And long after troops withdrew, the names remained: Tuyutí, Mud, Humaitá, throat-choked fortress, Curupaytí, river guns, echoing from schools and streets like a rosary of warning. This is what happens when states decide that the poor can be spent, and when rivers become the roads along which grief travels home. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.